Well, well, well. Here we are, 27 million people living on a resource-rich continent, and we're asked to survive on the crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table. What does it all mean? Why worry about it? We have the capacity as a sovereign nation state to resolve all the issues, or most of the issues, which face us as far as a revenue stream is concerned. Now, at this federal election, candidates will be promising you this and that, and political parties will promise this and that. But nobody is willing to mention the elephant in the room. The 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. As you realise, we live in a capitalist society, one based on private investment for private profit. Not a society based on a collection of small business people providing goods and services, but a society dominated by corporations. The logical endpoint of a capitalist society. Private investment for private profit. Big fish eat little fish, and bigger fish eat big fish. And that's been the history of the planet over the last 50 years during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation tsunami which has swept over the earth. And to a significant degree, Australia is a perfect example of what happens when governments give business the ability to make profits irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs. We're told that government should get out of the way of business, let them make a buck, and that buck will percolate to the rest of us like a coffee drippolator. But the fact is, nothing could be further from the truth. Year after year, we are faced with a statistical analysis which highlights that we have a trickle-down economy. Not a trickle-down economy, but a trickle-down economy. Removing government and a passive population, and that's what we are, from the equation, allows the corporate sector to get away with murder. And nothing highlights this more than this current campaign for the 2025 federal election. As you know, well, you may not know, I'm financing my own campaign in the Flinders electorate. I was invited by residents in the Flinders electorate to give people a choice. And my campaign is based on expanding the revenue stream. And you can access that by going to Toscano for Flinders, the Facebook page, or other pages. Now, I've spoken about this before, but what I'm interested in is the fact of the lack of real, incisive debate about why we, as people, as I said at the beginning, 27 million people living on a resource-rich continent, find ourselves fighting amongst ourselves about the crumbs that are brushed in our direction off the corporate table. Why? Now, obviously, a depoliticised, passive population contributes to the problem. a population which is diverted by a little bit of advertising and by a hatred which is encouraged and supported by the dominant forces in Australian society, a hatred for the other, a hatred for the minority, a hatred for the immigrant, First Nations Australians, people with different sexual orientation, as if they are the issue, as if they are the reason why people find themselves in this situation. I mean, it's ridiculous that in a country as rich as Australia, we have private charities, you know, trying to do the right thing, raising money to send Australian children to obtain a decent public education. How has the country come to this? How have we come to a situation where we fail so many of our children? It's obvious. It's obvious. For far too long, we have allowed the 1% that are the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 7 to 8% who profit from this successive government's investment-friendly laws to dominate the political agenda. That's why every time somebody attempts to get legislation through Parliament to address the housing crisis, to address the cost of living crisis, to address the fact that 1/3 of Australians live a hand-to-mouth existence on social security benefits, that somehow that legislation never comes to Parliament to be debated, and if occasionally it comes, it's easily defeated. Now I can say it's the fault of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. I can say it's the fault of the governments we elect. But ultimately it's your fault and my fault, because we have been seduced by the privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation, deregulation mantra, which has become an aspect of everyday life. It's a much more important mantra than any religious belief for the majority of people in this country. You know, for far too long, we have believed, as a people, that the only way to aspire to security and wealth is through allowing the 1% to dominate every aspect of our existence. So ultimately the fault is ours. Because one, for a variety of reasons, many not of our own making, we are a totally depoliticised society. And if we accept the fact that we're a depoliticised society, not only are we depoliticised society, we are a passive society, and we're passive for a variety of reasons. And one of the most important reasons is the fact that we are financially integrated into the system. Independence in a capitalist society is totally dependent on the amount of disposable income you have after you pay your bills. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're in debt up to your neck to keep a roof over your head, to educate your children, to access some basic necessities and a holiday here and there, well then you will tend to be passive. Because if you rock the boat, you may lose your job. And if you lose your job, you can't make the payments. And if you can't make the payments, it's a difficult situation, not just for you, but the people who are dependent on you, your small business, or your wage slavery, because that's all it is. So we tend to be passive, and as we get older, we become more passive because we're seduced by stories of crime, stories of scams and exploitation. Fear becomes the dominant aspect of our lives. And with the introduction of superannuation in the 1990s, we've integrated an increasing number of older Australians into the very system which exploits them. Half of every superannuation contributions to a non-self-managed fund are invested in the stock market, both locally and overseas. And we've seen how somebody's future retirement plans can be upended in a few days with the antics of Buffalini, the buffoon currently in the White House in the United States of America. So we have this insecurity. Some of it is manufactured, some of it is real. Most of it is based on financial insecurity. So we tend to be passive. We keep our heads below the parapet. We complain constantly. But when you ask people, what are you going to do about it? The answer is silence. Or, oh, somebody should do something about that. Or if you push further, they'll say, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. I'll do it after I finish my education. I'll do it after I have children. I'll do it after I've retired. And the list goes on and on. Before you know it, you're too frail and too old to do anything. And that's the dilemma. Living in a depoliticised society where we have left as a people, not all of us, but generally as a people, we have left it up to the private sector. We have left it up to the experts. We have left it up to our political representatives. We have left it up to the 1% to show us mercy as they accumulate more and more wealth and power. So ultimately, the type of society you create in a democracy, in a representative democracy where you elect representatives to make decisions for you for the next 3 years, is ultimately determined by how you cast your ballot. Obviously, there are some people in Australian society who are so disillusioned and cynical about the whole process that although by legislation they need to cast a ballot, they'll cast an informal vote, they won't vote, they'll shrug their shoulders, they'll say there's no point, you can't fight City Hall, it's going to be the same for all eternity. The fact is it's not the same for all eternity. The fact is that over time, this planet's surface is littered with the blood and bone of people who made a difference. Some made the ultimate sacrifice, not for God, king and country, but the ultimate sacrifice for the people around them, not just their family. Others were driven by extreme situations to ask, to beg, to fight for a bigger share of the pie. Today, the oppression we face in this country is not what we see in Sudan or Gaza or the southern parts of Lebanon or the Democratic Republic of Congo or any other troubled spot around the world. Today, the oppression we face in this country is existential. What I mean by that, it's based on the illusion that there's no other way. It's based on the illusion that change is impossible and impractical. irrespective of what happens after this election, the fact is that change comes from agitation from below. Some is based on a hope and a prayer, other is based on organisation. But ultimately it's our passivity as a people which is one of the major stumbling blocks to change. There have always been people in history who have initiated change. Some have made, as I said before, the ultimate sacrifice. There's always been people who are outsiders, who are on the margins, whose efforts make significant impressions on any movement, either cultural or political or social, which screams out for change. We may not be at the point of starvation as a people. We don't have bombs raining on us like the people of Gaza. But we have an oppression which is much more nebulous, much more difficult to pinpoint, cocooned by a legacy media and to a lesser extent a social media, which is all about maintaining the status quo and the private investment for private profit mantra, which is such an important part of our lives, that we tend to think that change is impossible. Now, voting in this country is a secret. It's a secret ballot. The secret ballot was invented in Australia. Initially around the world it was called the Australian ballot. You do have options. Now obviously some of you may have no options in terms of the calibre, the standard of the candidates which are standing in your electorate or for the Senate. But the fact is there are different people with different viewpoints who are saying that change is possible. Some want the status quo to remain. Some want the 1% who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication to continue to dominate not just the marketplace but every aspect of our lives. Some want to continue to marginalise First Nations Australians and refugees and immigrants and people with a different sexuality, people with disabilities. Somehow they think that efforts made to improve their situation is an attack on them and their standard of living. As I said last week, we are captured as a people between a neoliberalism vision and a vision based on identity politics. There is a huge middle ground that can be mined to create the conditions for change. So I ask you, when you look at your ballot paper, make the effort to understand the policies which have been promoted by particular candidates, whether they belong to political parties, whether they're standing as independents. And if you decide to cast a ballot, and most of you will, if you decide to exercise that minuscule right to elect a representative every 3 years to make decisions for you, despite the fact that they don't have to keep one of their promises to you, well then mark the ballot paper in the way that suits your opinions. Don't be swayed by advertising. Don't be swayed by fear. Don't be swayed by the fact that change is difficult. Ultimately, what type of society we create is dependent on you. You can be totally passive and accept whatever comes your way. You can be angry. But ultimately, it's not anger or passivity which changes things. Anger comes and goes. What changes things is the ability of people to organise and demand a better share of the pie. Because ultimately, why should we continue to fight among ourselves for the crumbs that are brushed off the corporate table in this country? We live on a resource-rich continent. We don't have billions of people on this continent. We have a miserable 27 million people who can't even acknowledge the beginning of this nation state, who can't even make amends to this country as a First Nations people, who year after year, decade after decade, continue to elect people to Parliament whose only grace, whose only strategy is to create fear and divide the community. Ultimately, those types of representatives only create more inequality and more fear. So, the ball's in your court, not in mine. I'm standing in the electorate of Flinders. If you go to the Facebook page Toscano for Flinders, you'll see the policies that I'm promoting, which I've spoken about in previous YouTube presentations. It's all about changing, shifting the focus of power from the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication to a wider number of people in our society.